Good afternoon and welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'm Stephen Flanagan, holder of the Henry Kissinger Chair in Diplomacy and National Security here, and it's really a pleasure to welcome our audience, particularly many members of the diplomatic corps and the media here at CSIS in Washington, as well as our viewers on C-SPAN and also over the World Wide Web. We are really truly delighted that Dr. Elizabeth Sherwood-Randall has agreed to join us here today to discuss the Obama administration's goals for the NATO summit in Chicago, now just 3 weeks away, and plans for sustaining the transatlantic relationship over the longer term. I think this very large turnout that we see in this room here, and I'm sure many more watching, as I say, on electronic media, is a real testament to our speaker. But more importantly, it's a strong counterpoint to those who suggest that no one in Washington is really all that interested in NATO anymore. And thank you for that cue. I would just remind you of the ground rules before we please turn off all electronic devices because we are recording this for posterity and for further dissemination. As we have just an hour, I'm going to be offering a very brief introduction of our speaker. You have her more complete bio in your program here. So the rules of the road are here. This is, as I said, being recorded, so it is on the record. Following Dr. Sherwood-Randall's remarks, I will offer a few brief initial questions and then open the floor for discussion from the audience. And we will adjourn promptly at 3 because, as I said, the summit is only 3 weeks away, not to mention everything else that's going on in Dr. Sherwood-Randall's area of responsibility. Some brief highlights of her career. She is, of course, Dr. Sherwood-Randall is Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and Senior Director for European Affairs on the National Security Staff. Prior to her service in the White House, she was a senior scholar affiliated with both the Council on Foreign Relations and Stanford's Center for International Security and Cooperation. She previously served in government as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia in the first Clinton administration, and as a senior advisor to Senator Joseph Biden during his service in the Senate. Dr. Sherwood-Randall earned her bachelor's degree from Harvard College and a DPhil in international relations from Oxford University, where she was a Rhodes Scholar. Dr. Sherwood-Randall, the floor is yours. Welcome to CSIS. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Steve is a very old colleague and friend. Not old, a valued colleague and friend.
Thank you for correcting.
And we have worked for so many years in and out of government on Europe and alliance issues together. It's really a privilege to be here, and I want to thank you for the work you and your team do here at CSIS. And I especially want to thank you for the work you did in support of NATO's new strategic concept. You were a critical partner to Madeleine Albright as she led the group of experts who provided very important input to the development of that strategic concept, which was agreed in Lisbon in November of 2010. I'm also happy to see so many friends here today, colleagues, members of the diplomatic community with whom I work very closely. Thank you for taking time to come and join us for this conversation. Many of you know I've devoted much of my career to working on strengthening our alliance with Europe, to ensuring that it is capable of meeting the threats we face together today, and that it is capable of adapting to a rapidly changing strategic environment. This has already happened many times before in NATO's history, and it is happening again today. We are, as Steve said, now less than 3 weeks from the NATO summit that the President will host in Chicago, and he's been bragging about hosting this summit in his hometown. It's the largest international event that he will host this year, with more than 60 delegations participating in the summit. Because today's program is titled From Lisbon to Chicago, I'd like to provide some context for that journey. You may recall that a little bit more than 2 months after President Obama took office in 2009, he traveled to Strasbourg, France, and Kiel, Germany, to attend NATO's 60th anniversary summit. On that first major overseas trip of his presidency, he also attended a G20 meeting in London. He met with EU leaders and delivered a speech on nuclear arms control and nonproliferation in Prague, and he visited Turkey. This trip was designed to signal both the breadth and depth of the relationship that he intended to have with Europe. I want to start with that point because it's important to understand how the President viewed NATO and our cooperation with Europe and the overall role of alliances and partnerships in our foreign policy from the outset of the Obama administration. In the early days of an administration, those of you who've served in government know you have the opportunity to set the trajectory for what will follow. And in Strasbourg, the President was very deliberate when he said, "We cannot be content to merely celebrate the achievements of the 20th century or enjoy the comforts of the 21st century. We must learn from the past to build on its success. We must renew our institutions, our alliances. We must seek the solutions to the challenges of this young century." So from the start of the administration, revitalizing our alliances has been a foundational element of our work. This includes our bilateral ties with Asia, but the best example that we can point to is our work with NATO. As the President has said repeatedly, NATO is the most successful alliance in human history, and together we have faced challenges that none could face alone. But it is also true that NATO has required stewardship, and NATO is at its best when it is based on mutual respect and guided by respected American leadership. President Obama has provided that leadership that NATO needed to reweave the fabric of the alliance, which had been badly frayed. Today, NATO stands united, and the alliance is doing more than ever to advance security within Europe, within the NATO treaty area, as well as beyond. The President views NATO as a unique American asset, and indeed it is an asset to every country that is a member of the alliance. No commitment is more solemn than the collective defense agreement we share with our NATO allies. The duty we have to each other to uphold Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which stipulates that an attack on one is an attack on all, serves as an unbreakable bond for the transatlantic community. Perhaps the value of this commitment isn't as apparent to some as it used to be now that we no longer need to look across the hills of Central Europe toward looming danger. But the truth is that we have to depend on each other now more than ever in practical terms, because we live in a very dynamic world and the reliability of an alliance is more important than ever. Afghanistan and NATO's other operations are prime examples of this. Currently, more than 125,000 Allied troops are serving in Afghanistan, and that takes place more than 3,000 miles from NATO's headquarters in Brussels, where troops from all 28 members serve with troops from 22 non-members, partner countries who have joined in the ISAF mission. Only NATO has the integrated command and control structure that could manage such a complex undertaking. And 7,000 more soldiers are maintaining security in the Balkans, where KFOR continues to play a crucial role, including providing the assurance of a safe and secure environment during the Serbian presidential elections that will take place this coming Sunday, presidential and parliamentary elections. NATO is also conducting maritime operations under a NATO flag. And as you know, last year we successfully concluded a critical mission in Libya that saved countless lives. There really isn't an issue today that is of national security importance that we do not work on with our European allies. Countering terrorism, dealing with weapons of mass destruction and ballistic missile proliferation, addressing cybersecurity, enhancing energy security. The list goes on and on. When we act with our allies, with countries that share our values and that we can rely on, whether in Afghanistan or in the skies over Libya or combating piracy, it not only increases the international legitimacy of our efforts, but at the same time it reduces the burden to the United States. So the belief the President set forth as a guiding principle for our foreign policy, that we are stronger when we stand together with allies and partners, has brought us to the place that we find ourselves today, with a re-energized and united NATO. At the Lisbon summit in November of 2010, the President tasked us to recapture NATO's potential and focus it on the future. As you know, at Lisbon, France rejoined NATO's military structures. Allies agreed on a clear process for the transition of security in Afghanistan, and we defined the critical 21st century defense capabilities that NATO required. Perhaps most important, the alliance also presented its current strategic concept, which is NATO's roadmap for the future, essentially its updated mission statement. This document set a solid course for future transformation. I can tell you that it hasn't always been easy, and those who know NATO understand that its transformation is perpetual, but that is part of its dynamism. And we've made tremendous progress in just the 18 months since the last summit in implementing the goals we set for ourselves in Lisbon. I want to provide you with some specific examples of that progress and explain how we intend to carry it forward in a few weeks' time in Chicago. We have three main substantive dimensions of our summit, which involve, first, NATO's military mission in Afghanistan, second, its development of defense capabilities for the future, and third, its efforts to increase and incentivize the contributions of NATO's partners. So first, on Afghanistan. Operationally, NATO has maintained the highest op tempo the alliance has ever experienced in the last 2 years. In Afghanistan, while continuing to help the Afghans to maintain a secure environment throughout the country, we began to implement the Lisbon framework in July 2011 with the start of transition. From that point to today, we have handed over security responsibility to the Afghan forces in areas that comprise more than half the population of the country. With our allies and partners, we have continued to train the Afghan army and police, and we've witnessed growth in their size and their ability, as we've worked with the Afghan government to build capacity for the development of its institutions as well. At the Chicago summit, in line with what the President said in his speech on Afghanistan last June, we will shape the next phase of transition. To be clear, this is not a departure from the Lisbon framework and the course that was agreed there by allies, partners, and the government of Afghanistan to complete the transition by the end of 2014. Setting forth the next phase of transition in Chicago is an important step that will ensure that we complete our work on time. In order to ensure a responsible transition of security, we have judged that it's necessary to develop milestones along the way, and it's our intention to do that in Chicago. In addition, and very much in support of the transition process, we want the Afghan National Security Forces, the ANSF, to be able to maintain security once it is in their hands. We have witnessed a qualitative improvement in the Afghan forces, as demonstrated in their response to the recent attacks in Kabul. They're taking more of the lead in areas where NATO and ISAF forces are partnered with them, and they have taken on greater responsibilities for training. These positive signs need to be reinforced in our judgment by a tangible commitment from NATO allies and partners to the sustainability of the Afghan forces beyond transition, and we are working toward that goal for the summit as well. Finally, as transition progresses, and as we commit to contributions that sustain the ANSF after that transition is completed, we have to look beyond the end of our combat mission in 2014, and together with our Afghan partners, further define the long-term relationship between NATO and Afghanistan. The conclusion recently of the U.S.-Afghanistan Strategic Partnership Agreement is a significant step in demonstrating our enduring commitment. Several other allied countries have also recently reached similar agreements with the Afghans. NATO's collective support for training, advising, and assisting the Afghans once they are fully responsible for their own country will add needed confidence. Our work in Afghanistan is substantial, and it requires our continued dedication. But NATO proved in March of 2011 that the alliance also stands ready for new challenges, even unexpected challenges. Then the President judged that NATO should play a leading role in fulfilling the UN mandate in Libya, because he knew that only NATO had the capacity to provide the command and control necessary to integrate multiple allied and partner air forces in an effective operation. Operation Unified Protector in Libya demonstrated the versatility, capability, and truly unique quality of NATO in its rapid response to conduct political consultations, perform military planning and preparations, deploy forces, and integrate partners into kinetic operations. There is no other group of countries on earth that could do what we did so successfully for the Libyan people. And I will underscore that in 9 days, just 9 days, we went from a UN resolution to putting aircraft in the skies over Libya. We all know that NATO succeeded in protecting civilians and that change is now in the hands of the Libyan people. While the military intervention in Libya was successful, we also focused on important lessons to be learned from that operation. And that dovetailed with work already underway to learn excuse me, the lessons of Afghanistan for the alliance. This brings me to the second area of progress since Lisbon and the second key priority for the summit, which is on defense capabilities. The Libya operation highlighted heavy Allied dependence on the United States for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets. We therefore seized the initiative and have worked to secure common funding for an Allied intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capability called the Alliance Ground Surveillance Program, or AGS. This program will help NATO acquire a long-range UAV capability that would not be affordable for most allies on an individual basis, and is a superb example of defense burden sharing, or what Secretary General Rasmussen calls smart defense. We support his efforts as a useful means of meeting the goals NATO has set for the development of the critical capabilities that it needs. It allows allies to prioritize, to pool resources and share capabilities, and to specialize where appropriate. NATO as a whole will benefit, and the whole will be stronger than the parts. This is not to say we were not concerned about capabilities even before the Libya operation. Coming into the administration, those of us who worked on NATO, and many of you are here today, were keenly aware of a growing gap between American and Allied military capabilities. From the start, the President directed us to place a high priority on NATO maintaining the military capabilities it needs to achieve its objectives, on doing contingency planning for all allies, and on developing new capabilities where they are required. So at Lisbon, with his NATO counterparts, the President set a number of capabilities objectives for the alliance to achieve. Work is ongoing in areas such as the protection of NATO's computer networks and innovative ways to counter IEDs in Afghanistan and elsewhere. But perhaps the best example of the President's commitment to NATO's capabilities of the future is our work on missile defense. The United States is heavily investing in Europe's security through the development of a NATO missile defense capability. At Lisbon, our leaders agreed that the alliance would develop the capability to defend our populations and territories against ballistic missile attack. We offered, and our allies welcomed, the U.S. contribution of the European phased adaptive approach towards realizing this important objective. Its first phase includes the deployment of a radar in Turkey and an Aegis ship in the Mediterranean that can begin to defend European territory and populations. Since Lisbon, this phase was completed consistent with the commitment the President made to Congress at the end of 2011, and now additional work is underway on the next phase. At Chicago, it is our intent to declare an interim capability for NATO missile defense based on the ability to employ U.S. assets under NATO command should conditions warrant. We also will conclude the Deterrence and Defense Posture Review, or the DDPR, that was tasked by NATO heads of state and government at Lisbon. The DDPR will identify the appropriate mix of nuclear, conventional, and missile defense capabilities that NATO needs to meet 21st century security challenges. We expect it to be approved by NATO heads of state and government in Chicago, and it will reaffirm NATO's determination to maintain modern and flexible capabilities. These are the concrete deliverables that the President has committed to achieving. Fulfilling them will make the alliance stronger and ensure that the alliance can manage the challenges we all face on the fiscal front while fielding the forces it needs to meet the challenges of today and the future. The third area of progress since the Lisbon summit, and the last area of our focus for the Chicago summit, is on NATO's partnerships. The strategic concept of 2010 presents a comprehensive view regarding the value of partners and the desirable and necessary role that they play. Specifically, it notes that the promotion of Euro-Atlantic security is best assured through a wide network of partner relationships with countries and organizations around the globe. The partnerships make a concrete and valued contribution to the success of NATO's fundamental tasks. To put it simply, although NATO is regionally based, the threats we face are now global, and partners add real value to alliance security. All in all, more than 6,000 troops from partner countries support NATO's efforts in Afghanistan and in the Balkans. In Libya, for the first time, Arab state partners played critical roles in the strike mission. Partners also contribute financially to NATO's operations, conduct training for local forces to help them become more self-sufficient, and add political support and legitimacy to our efforts. In terms of progress made since Lisbon, in April of 2011, when NATO's foreign ministers met in Berlin, they agreed to a set of partnership reforms called for in the strategic concept and recommended by our partners. These included three major components. First, they made additional tools and resources available to all of NATO's partners, including training and support for security sector reform. Second, they instituted a new system of consultations to allow allies to meet with partners in what is called in NATO-EASE flexible formats. That is, consultations can happen on specific issues with any configuration of partners who are interested in talking to one another. And third, the partnership reforms agreed in Lisbon helped to institutionalize early and regular cooperation between the alliance and capable partners in a given operation. Through its dynamic partnerships, NATO has been emerging as the hub of a global security network. And we will use the Chicago summit to demonstrate the value added by partners and to incentivize increased participation and contributions from our global partners. At the summit, allies will meet with partners in several sessions to take stock of the work already underway in ongoing operations and to further enhance our relationships. Let me mention Russia in this context. Russia is an important partner for NATO, and we have worked hard on developing that partnership since the time I served in the Clinton administration at the Pentagon. In fact, we just marked the 15th anniversary of NATO-Russia ties, and Russia has provided substantial support as a major conduit for supplies and personnel to Afghanistan, with over 42,000 containers of cargo transiting Russia to date in support of U.S. troops and our ISAF partners. It also conducts important counter-narcotics training for Afghans. 2,000 officers have been trained under the NATO-Russia Council program. For these reasons, we have invited Russia to participate in the ISAF summit at Chicago. Unlike at Lisbon, NATO's leaders will not hold a meeting of the NATO-Russia Council in Chicago. President-elect Putin and Secretary General Rasmussen made that decision based on the timing of the event, but President Obama continues to support our work to enhance NATO-Russia cooperation going forward. He also supports NATO having candid conversations in this forum on areas of disagreement with Russia, such as our view that NATO's door must remain open to new members, that nations must be free to choose their own alliances, and that we reject Russia's recognition and continued occupation of the separatist regions of Georgia. We're not interested in outdated and zero-sum thinking with respect to each other's security, and we want to use the NRC to further practical cooperation. Finding common ground, for example, on missile defense is a worthy endeavor with great potential benefits for NATO and for Russia. The NATO-Russia Council's recently concluded missile defense exercise, the first that has taken place since 2008, was an important step forward. We have a lot more work to do on that front, and we're committed to doing it. In conclusion, given the presence of members of the diplomatic community here who are both members and partners of NATO, I want to acknowledge the tremendous work that is done every day by representatives of each NATO country and each partner country to carry forward the revitalization of this alliance. I'd also like to recognize the men and women who serve our nations on the front lines in the difficult missions we ask them to conduct with courage and at times with great sacrifice. They have guaranteed our collective freedom for more than 60 years. Now, I haven't been working on NATO that long, but some days it feels that way. The President looks forward to beginning the next chapter in this alliance's storied history when he welcomes his counterparts to the third summit on American territory and the first outside of Washington in the alliance's history on May 20th and 21st. Thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Liz. Okay, as I mentioned before we opened to the floor, I just thought I would pose a few questions to our guest just to get things started and to pick up a few strands that she left in her opening remarks. First on Afghanistan, Liz, you talked about the scope and the nature of the commitment and the support to the Afghan transition and beyond the 2014 presence. There have been various figures put out as to what the actual costs of this are, what the size of the ultimate Afghan national security forces will be as a result, and they can be sustained. But there's also the question of beyond money, what else this group of committed states that, including a number of allies, which, as you said, have already announced partnerships of various kinds with the Afghans over the long term, what other kind of presence and commitment do you envision, or do you think the allies are willing to support beyond 2014 in the area of training and advancement of the capabilities of the Afghan security forces?
Thanks, Steve. Thus far, there has been substantial interest in continuing a mission that trains and advises the Afghan forces. Allies have invested a great deal of blood and treasure in Afghanistan, as have partners. And there is appreciation of the necessity to sustain the gains we have made and to ensure that Afghanistan does not again become a safe haven for terrorists. And so we heard at the Foreign and Defense Ministerial, called the Jumbo Ministerial in Brussels 2 weeks ago, that allies are prepared to do this work together post-2014. There's an additional element which will be addressed in the summer, which is the whole project of building an Afghanistan that is sustainable economically. Because, of course, Afghanistan has been supported by the international community during this period of war, and it will have to get on its own feet financially as well. So there's a substantial commitment that the international community is working to generate on the development front to assist Afghanistan on its economic growth and sustainability.
Good, thank you. On the military capabilities initiative, as you know, this is sort of joining a list of various initiatives in the capabilities area that NATO's had over the years. But there is a sense, certainly among some, and some allies certainly saying, you know, given the nature of the financial crisis, given the nature of the sovereign debt crises that a number of them are facing, we really do have to do things differently. Do you think, as you look at in your consultations with allied governments, and we have certainly a number of representatives of allied governments in the audience who can address this later, but do you see something fundamentally different here that'll make smart defense? As I heard on Capitol Hill, some asking questions last week, is smart defense just another gimmick, another way to camouflage the fact that Europeans aren't doing enough on defense? Or how is this going to become a way of doing business within the alliance, or how do you think it can become a way that will really make a difference and end up with NATO doing as it's going to commit to do, to spend truly more wisely the resources, still enormous resources, that many European governments devote to defense?
I think that is the silver lining in the economic cloud, which is that this is disciplining us to be rigorous about how defense dollars and euros and other currencies are spent, to ensure that there is value added by the expenditures of each country. And we do have countries that have not sufficiently disciplined their spending to focus on what's most important. And countries are increasingly looking at ways to cooperate among themselves, especially regionally, so that they can purchase assets together that may be useful, either in smaller groupings or, as I said, through commonly funded projects like the Alliance Ground Surveillance System. But we have a good example of this that we're working on Baltic air policing for the summit, which is an initiative that will ensure that the skies over the Baltic countries continue to be patrolled with additional support provided by the Baltic states themselves. And this has been an effort in which we have lined up commitments over a number of years, and the Baltics have stepped forward to provide their own contributions. And we're working this in a way that shows that everybody does their fair share. So I actually am hopeful that in this period of fiscal constraints, we will generate the capabilities that are required and achieve the goals that we have set for the alliance in a way that will make it capable of meeting the challenges that we'll face.
Great. Thank you. And lastly, sure, we still have 25 minutes more for general questions. On partnerships, you alluded to the gains that certainly came in our dealings, particularly with countries in the Mediterranean region in the aftermath of Operation Unified Protector, and it proved that NATO was not only capable of helping to assist security in that region, but not toxic politically in the Arab Middle East. What gains have you seen, and what gains do you expect to see made at Chicago in terms of advancing that particular set of partnerships?
We are working on various elements of that, some of which I can't actually describe here because they will be to be demonstrated at the summit. But the participation of a number of partners in summit events and the language that is included in summit communiques for those who peruse them will indicate that this is a very important element of NATO's future.
Good. Well, thank you. Okay, let's go to the floor. I would just ask if you please wait for a microphone and identify yourself. And I see a question here, Stephen Larrabee, right here in the second row.
Steve Larrabee, RAND.
Hello, Steve.
Hi, Liz. As you know, next Sunday there's an election in France, and the polls, if they're accurate, seem to suggest that Francois Hollande will become the next president. That means that he will be coming to the summit approximately 3 days after he's been inaugurated and put together his cabinet. It seems to me it's likely that under those circumstances, he's not going to be in a very good position to make commitments on a number of things, particularly missile defense. I'm just wondering what impact you think this will have and how you plan to handle it if he's elected.
Fortunately, most of our governments have permanent bureaucracies that do the work every day to keep commitments and advance toward goals that we work on in the NATO context. And it is our expectation that if there is a change in French government, that France's reintegration into NATO will be sustained and that France will remain a very important contributor to NATO operations, and that the new government will appreciate the value that we are providing to the alliance with the missile defense architecture that we have offered it. So I'm fairly confident, Steve, that we will have a successful summit, whoever represents the government of France in Chicago.
Thank you. Yes, we have a couple of questions here in the middle. Could we, yes, the gentleman in the second row, and then the third row after that.
Thank you very much. Josh Rogan, Foreign Policy Magazine. I'd love to ask you about Syria. As you know, Turkey is considering whether to formally invoke Article 4. Here in Washington, the U.S. government is doing preparations for various contingencies in Syria. But I'm wondering, is NATO doing preparations for various contingencies in Syria should Turkey invoke Article 4 and leading to an Article 5? And do you expect this to be on a part of the discussions, either public or private, in Chicago? And what will be the U.S. position on NATO's involvement in Article 4 and Article 5 discussions? Thank you.
Thanks, Josh. Allies consult on many issues all the time, bilaterally and in the NATO context. The Turkish foreign minister briefed his counterparts at the NATO foreign ministerial that just took place in Brussels on Syria. and there are ongoing discussions in the alliance about it. And our Supreme Allied Commander can do a certain amount of planning, as he does for various contingencies around the world. But there has been no formal tasking, and there has been no formal request by the Turks for consultations in an Article 4 or Article 5 scenario. So we will continue our work on Syria together. We've had extensive discussions with the Turks bilaterally as well. The President met with Prime Minister Erdogan in Seoul when he was there most recently, and we continue to stay in very close touch with them on the coordination of our responses to the situation there, in which there is continuing terrible violence against the Syrian people.
Yes, and then the next row there, this gentleman.
My name is Said Zafar Hashimi from Voice of America's Afghanistan Service. In your remarks, you're referring to Afghanistan's future engagement with NATO and the U.S. that will be discussed in Chicago summit. So I was wondering, what would be the U.S.'s position in terms of its engagement, especially military engagement and presence beyond 2014 when it comes to anti-terrorism combat forces or nature of its military operations?
So that is something that we're working on now with our allies and partners in the ISAF context, and that's something that will be discussed at the summit. And I think I'll have to encourage you to watch this space in Chicago and to hear what the leaders have agreed on that subject.
There's a question here on the far end, Natalia. Oh, right. And then I'll come back to you.
Hi, I'm Mike Costi, recently retired from the Senate Armed Services Committee, and nice to see you again.
Nice to see you.
We had a discussion not long ago at the Atlantic Council on a subject that came up that there was a perception that may be raised in Chicago by a couple of our allies. We always point out that we want the Europeans to do more, and we have been working with them on various developmental projects over the last number of years, one of which they seem to be very antagonistic toward the fact that they feel that we've kind of pulled the rug out from under them on MEADS. Mm-hmm. And I was surprised at how strongly opinions were voiced on this, and opinions to the effect that there will be some discussion of this in Chicago. I don't know as much about it as I should, but I'd like to hear your opinion of where you think that might go.
This is an issue that about which there are strong views in Congress, and I think that will not be a topic at Chicago. I think that it is a topic for bilateral discussions with our German and Italian colleagues, and it takes place principally in defense channels, but I don't anticipate it being on the agenda at Chicago.
Yes, there was a question here in the second row.
Hello. My name is Uroš Piper. I'm correspondent of Serbian national news agency Tanjug. Mm-hmm. My question is on Serbia and Western Balkans, and Serbia still is not a member of the NATO. Do you think that would be better if she enters the NATO in the future, and would that be possible if we remember the past and the war between NATO and Serbia in 1999? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, as I said, we believe NATO's door should remain open to all the countries of Europe that are capable of achieving the standards that NATO sets for membership and are capable of contributing to NATO operations. And if Serbia continues on its reform path, and if the Serbian people choose to pursue further integration into European and Euro-Atlantic institutions, NATO's door will be open. As you know, we have had discussions with Serbia about cooperation with NATO, and there is a great deal of interest among a number of allies in enhancing that cooperation. And so, assuming that as Euro elections take place and a new government comes into power, if it chooses to continue to invest in ties with NATO, that opportunity will be presented to the Serbian people to expand your cooperation with NATO.
I think we may have some other questions. Yes, on this right here, and then on both sides of that aisle, please. Go ahead. First, the gentleman, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Alison Fortier.
Tolga Tanisuri, Turkish Daily. I had a quick question, Dr. Randall, about the missile defense system. Mm-hmm. Right now, the radar which has been deployed on Turkey is on operation, and it is under the command of US and Turkey, so it is not under the command of NATO. What kind of decision will you make in Chicago regarding this radar, and also if you clarify what kind of facilities will you need from Turkey in terms of this radar and the phase 1 missile defense phase 1
So
in the
as
near
I-
future? How many facilities will there in Turkey in terms
As
of
I
this
said
radar?
in my remarks, one of our goals for the summit is to declare interim capability, which would allow us to transfer command and control to NATO. And that would include for the radar that is placed in Turkey. And our objective is to achieve that. There's lots of work underway to get to that point. It requires the involvement of many military planners in many countries and at SHAPE at the military headquarters in Mons, Belgium. But we're hopeful we'll achieve that goal.
Yes, Allison.
Dr. Sherwood-Randall, I'm Allison Fortier from Lockheed Martin.
Hello, Allison.
This administration has done a really remarkable job in moving the missile defense issue forward. Both the NATO statement on territorial defense, very brave decision that Turkey took, Spain, Poland, Romania, a lot of accomplishments. Are you concerned as you move toward the Chicago summit that some in Congress, including the House Armed Services Committee, are criticizing NATO, the missile defense architecture, and are advocating instead for a third site in the United States? And does the administration have plans to step up its campaign in Congress in support of the phased adaptive approach?
We're fully committed to the phased adaptive approach because we believe that it is the best approach to meeting the evolving, emerging threat. And so this architecture, which we developed when we came into office, which was a change from the program of record, as you know, was developed because of two factors. One, that the threat assessments that we received suggested a more imminent threat to Europe than had previously been judged to be the case. And second, that our technology had developed in such a fashion that we could field systems that were more capable of defending Europe. And so taking those two together, we decided that we would offer this new architecture to Europe, which has the benefit of being adaptable as the threat evolves. And conceivably, the threat could evolve in a positive way, that is, the threat could be diminished. But so long as we judge that there is a serious ballistic missile threat to Europe, we will continue to proceed forward as we have committed to doing. And we have a number of allies who have offered support for that. That is in terms of basing agreements. And there are other allies who would like to participate as the architecture develops. And we're committed to fulfilling this offer to NATO to field the full system.
But just to flesh out the argument that Ms. Fortier alluded to, some on the Hill are saying, well, but this really, what does this really do for the United States? I mean, is this another example of the U.S. sharing Europe's burden in defense, in a sense? And could you address how does this contribute to overall transatlantic security?
Well, this also does have the benefit of defending the United States. And so we have, if it would, as we field the system, and we see the evolution of the capabilities of the potential adversaries, we know that this would also provide coverage, intercept capability for the United States in the event of an attack on American soil. That has been fundamental since the start for us. There had to be an American national interest in this as well. And so this is about both defense of European territory and American territory.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, there was a question way in the back. I can't see, and then I'll come back over here, Mark. Like the second to last row, I saw a young gentleman. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sherwood-Randall, for your remarks today. I want to touch on something you said about, with regards to Serbia capable of becoming a member, of adhering to the criteria for membership, and bring up the point of Macedonia. Macedonia has adhered to the criteria of membership since 2008, and with the recent ruling of the ICJ this past December, international law has spoken that Greece's veto of Macedonia based on this name dispute is illegal. Where do you see the future of Macedonia? How do you see the United States administration taking on this role, and are they going to be willing to be an advocate for Macedonia moving forward on this matter? Thank you.
Thank you. We have worked very hard behind the scenes to achieve a resolution to the standoff over the Macedonian name issue. One of the things the President has mused about is the many things that you have to know about as President, and one of those is the Macedonian name issue. And he himself has been involved in discussions with key counterparts on this issue, And unfortunately, it has not been resolved in time for the NATO summit in Chicago. But we continue to hope that this will be resolved so that Macedonia can take its place as a NATO member.
Inshallah. Yes, Ambassador Hunter, and then we'll come back here, over here, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Robert Hunter, National Defense University. Elizabeth, thank you for an excellent presentation. Summits are often about things that get done then. They can also be about things that one tries to do in the future. I was wondering if you have any plans for, to use that wonderful phrase, the summit tasks the North Atlantic Council in permanent session to look at the following. I have a few ideas. One that you haven't mentioned, I gather, not going to be very prominent: comprehensive approach, relation to the European Union, and what to do in areas of the Middle East, including North Africa, whether there are various things that NATO and the EU and the rest of us will have to do there. Do you have some ambitions for the future you'd like to see get on that particular forward-looking agenda? Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Hunter is one of the people who taught me what I know about NATO. So, Bob.
Then you're in trouble.
I didn't mention it because it is so much the stuff of our everyday business. That is, we are working collaboratively with the EU on many fronts, trying to define what the EU can bring to the table that is complementary to what NATO can do. And for example, we are talking with the EU about its long-term role in Afghanistan that will complement what nations are doing in Afghanistan. That is also true with regard to the Middle East and North Africa, where we have an extensive ongoing dialogue with Cathy Ashton and her team, and in which we've tried to a certain degree to divvy up labor, because there's so much to be done. And the EU, for example, has taken a lead in Tunisia, and we have said that's terrific. We will support that, we'll be involved, but we will understand that you'll be in a leading role. And so across the board on the Arab Spring, the EU has been a very important partner. Now, as you know, there are issues at a level of principle that have not yet been resolved between NATO and the EU. And what we're trying to do is, at a practical level, encourage the growth of cooperation to ensure operational effectiveness in a wide number of areas, and over time, reach agreement on some of those principles that need to be resolved.
Yes, two questions here along the front row. Sorry, Natalia, why don't you come along across the front? And yes, Mark Jacobson.
Thank you. Mark Jacobson from the German Marshall Fund, formerly of ISAF. Good to see you again. I'm very encouraged by what I'm hearing in terms of partnerships, that based on Secretary General Rasmussen's comments March of 2011 in Warsaw, that threats emanate from outside of Europe, and these are things NATO has to deal with, and this will be something that will be addressed in Chicago. What I'm concerned about, though, is what I'm hearing from many European colleagues, that is a desire for NATO to retrench, that Afghanistan is too tough, cyber is too complex, and that we ought to focus on basic territorial defense. How will the United States combat that sort of view in terms of, and I'm not trying to coin a phrase here, but moving towards a real global partnership for peace program?
Thank you, Mark. You know, I think that debate about whether NATO should be about territorial defense or an expeditionary alliance is one that has not been central to our dialogue with our allied colleagues, because it has increasingly become evident that we have to do both. And that as the President has reassured allies of our fundamental commitment to Article 5, we've conducted contingency planning, we've supported Baltic air policing, we've provided the missile defense architecture. There is an understanding on the part of allies that their security is not going to be reduced by the commitments we must make beyond Europe to ensure our security, because that's where the threats emanate from, by and large. And so while this has been a subject of discussion since the creation of NATO, since the alliance had a defined treaty area, but the principal allies have always had interests outside of Europe where they expected that they would receive the support of their allies to defend those interests. I see this as being a dynamic conversation, but not one in which allies are seeing black and white, either or, zero sum, but rather this alliance has got to do both going forward.
Yes, Ambassador. Yes, sir.
Union Ambassador Pavilionis. Last week you've been in Chicago inspecting the venue and site before the summit, and you met some immigrant communities, Baltic one including. So what do you think about that trip? Was it the right choice to make summit in Chicago?
So Žygis Pavilionis, the Lithuanian ambassador, and I, and several other ambassadors, some of whom are here today with us, from Estonia, from Romania, from the Czech Republic, joined us in Chicago to speak with a number of the ethnic communities that represent a number of our new allies in the Chicago area. And it was an extraordinarily powerful experience. Ben Rhodes, our Deputy National Security Advisor, and I traveled there together. And the palpable sense of what this administration has done for NATO to make new allies feel that they are allies, full stop, that there isn't a distinction between old members and new members, but that we are all allies together and all have made this solemn pledge to live up to our Article 5 commitments was a very positive experience. And hearing what you and your colleagues had to say about what NATO means to your countries was also very moving, because it helped us to appreciate the value that is being added by this alliance in Central and Eastern Europe. The other element of those conversations, which was very important, was we talked in several different public fora about the role that the Central and Eastern European allies are playing in some of the democratic transformations that are taking place, both to their east and also in the Middle East and North Africa. And there, these countries have much more recent experience with transformation, indeed revolution. And so they can play a very significant leadership role and are keen to do so. And we're very proud of that role that they are seeking to play in helping other countries learn from their own experience and build new institutions of democratic governance going forward. Thanks, Žygis.
Well, we're on this theme. Oh, is there, I'm sorry, I'm having this one, I'm sorry, this, in that second row there, sorry. I was blinded by the light.
Colin Clark, AOL Defense. It's always interesting to hear talk about burden sharing and all. I'm looking at a briefing by Adrian Kendry of NATO about the share of U.S. spending. In 2001, it was about 50%. Now it's about 75% of NATO spending. You're going to the heartland of America where people care about taxpayers' dollars. When are we going to see a shift in European defense spending in NATO? I offer that to anyone in the audience who'd like to address it as well.
I think you can anticipate a growth in European defense spending when Europe is, has recovered from the economic crisis. And obviously there's a lot of work to be done on that front. And we could have a much broader conversation about the challenges that Europe is facing right now and the implications for Europe's future as well as for ours, because we are so interdependent economically that this affects our growth as well. That said, we have got to find a way to maintain our alliance capabilities in this period of fiscal constraint, and that's what we're working to do. And it's very tough, but I will say that on a number of initiatives, for example, on alliance ground surveillance, where the President was personally involved in speaking to counterparts about the importance of making this investment, we have succeeded in securing the kind of funding necessary to buy this capability. And in these fiscal times, that was something that his colleagues were willing to step forward and do. And so our judgment is that when we prioritize and we make clear what the benefit will be to allies, allies are willing to take the steps necessary to provide NATO with the means to do the job.
Well, I think that's a good coda for our ending, and let's hope that that does in fact prove to be the case, that, that in these difficult times that allies will agree on a plan for effective prioritization and better use of those resources that are available to help maintain the transatlantic relationship. Dr. Sherwood-Randall, you've been very generous with your time. I think we've covered the whole waterfront. There are certainly a number of issues we could bore down on, as was just suggested, but I really want to thank you for making the time for this. after just coming back from Chicago on a similar mission to give as much of a preview as you could on the summit agenda. We wish you great success next month, and we look forward to maybe having you back here again to discuss the way ahead from Chicago. Thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you,
Sherwood-Randall.
Stephen. Thanks to all of you for being here.